scientists, Albert Einstein, and world government. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Richie Brown Show, and we are looking at an article I've written today regarding Albert Einstein's battle with 4 Soviet scientists right after World War II. Albert Einstein was pushing for world government at the time, as was the United States, Britain, and a lot of Europe. There was essentially a partnership of British American imperialism to take control over the world, and they were doing that via organizations that we recognize as fundamentally capitalist-controlled organizations like the United Nations, World Health Organization, that kind of thing. But those were never... They weren't just suddenly corrupted in recent years. They were set up as world government. They were set up by the Rockefellers, for instance. A lot of the money to set up the United Nations came from the Rockefellers. Right, let's get into the article. 4 Soviet scientists, Proletarian Internationalism versus Einstein and Capitalist-Cosmopolitanism. Rightists now get to claim that the push for world government and lockdown via certain events is some kind of neo-Bolshevik conspiracy. People spreading such propaganda are probably paid assets of the CIA. After all, the CIA's main job was to create a worldwide anti-communist ideology, purely so USA can control the world's wealth, culture, and means of subsistence.
The CIA is not an intelligence agency, it's a covert action agency. Covert action being overthrowing or supporting foreign governments. Another part of covert action is disinformation. And the American people, in my estimation, are the primary target audience of the agency's disinformation operation. One function of the agency, as noted by the Church Committee, is to create an international anti-communist ideology. Well, it's my thesis the reason you want to create this international anti-communist ideology is so that when you go down to Nicaragua and you want to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, well, you can't justify to the American people going down there and overthrowing that government unless you can link it to a greater threat. It's just a little insignificant nation. But if you can link it to a greater threat, then you're justified in overthrowing it. And that's exactly what's happening in Nicaragua. It's not the Nicaraguans fighting to sustain the way of life that they want. It's the Cubans or the Soviets and Cubans.
However, for many honest people wondering where the push for world government under various methods of control like the pandemic treaty come from, we should examine where the concept of world government has come from. The short answer is capitalists and their ideologues. For the longer answer, we will examine a public debate between Einstein and 4 Soviet scientists. Immediately following the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the imperialists in the United States, who had set up numerous supranational organizations for worldwide control, began pushing openly for world government. The nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the lying imperialist press claims it was a quick victory against a costly ground war. As Eisenhower wrote, Japan was already defeated and dropping the bombs was unnecessary. The nuclear bombing of those 2 cities therefore served 2 functions: to prevent the Soviet Union entering the war against Japan and keeping Soviet influence out of Japan. 2, to blackmail the entire world into one world government. So who was the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki truly aimed at? The answer can only be the world population at large to terrify them. But why would the revolting United States want to terrify the world's populations? For what purpose? World government is the answer. Nuclear blackmail for world government and Albert Einstein. In 1944, Friedrich Hayek releases his Road to Serfdom. Thatcher was known to slam down Hayek's book and declare, "This is what we believe." In The Road to Serfdom, Hayek calls for a world federation. So you could call Hayek and the Thatcherites the original globalists. In 1945, the nuclear assault on Japan, the world shivered with fear at the use of such a powerful weapon against the mostly civilian population. In the wake of this terror, Einstein issued a letter calling for world governments, to which 4 Soviet scientists issued a retort in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, 1948. Einstein argued in impassioned terms, quote, "Is it really unavoidable that because of our passions and our inherited customs, we should be condemned to annihilate each other so thoroughly that nothing would be left over which would deserve to be conserved? Is it not true that all the controversies and differences of opinion which we have touched upon in our strange exchange of letters are insignificant pettiness compared to the danger in which we will find ourselves? Should we not do everything in our power to eliminate the danger which threatens all nations alike? If we hold fast to the concept and practice of a limited sovereignty of nations, it only means that each country reserves the right for itself of pursuing its objectives through warlike means. Under the circumstances, every nation must be prepared for that possibility. This means it must try with all its might to be superior to anyone else. This objective will dominate more and more our entire public life and will poison our youth long before the catastrophe is itself actually upon us. We must not tolerate this, however, as long as we still retain a tiny bit of calm reasoning and human feelings. This alone is on my mind in supporting the idea of world government, without any regard to what other people may have in mind when working for the same objective. I advocate world government because I am convinced that there is no possible other way of eliminating the most terrible danger in which man has ever found himself. The objective of avoiding total destruction must have priority over any other objective. I'm sure you are convinced that this letter is written with all the seriousness and honesty at my command. I trust you will accept it in the same spirit." Unquote. The Soviet scientists stated that world government was not a new, but a natural development of capitalist imperialist conniving. From their reply, quote, "World government is aim of imperialists. First of all, the ideas of world government and superstate are not at all a product of the atom age. They have a long enough history. It is enough to recall that they have already been promoted at the origin of the League of Nations. Furthermore, in the present historic epoch, such ideas were never progressive. They reflected the fact that capitalist monopolies, which are dominant in the principal industrial countries, have not enough room within the framework of their own countries. They need world markets, world sources of raw materials and regions for investment capital. Domination of monopolies in political life and in the state machine of great powers permits use of this machine for their struggle for spheres of influence and for economic and political enslavement of foreign countries, which must give the monopolists a chance to possess foreign territory as at home." Pointing out that the Great October Revolution was what gave the Soviets their independence and freedom from the slavery of world capitalist monopolies. Quote, "The Great October Socialist Revolution smashed the chains of economic and political dependence of our country on world capitalist monopolies. The Soviet government for the first time made our country a truly and free independent state. After the Bolsheviks came to power, they were truly the world's first independent state. They denounced the debts that the French and British banks had enslaved their country with, and opened up all their foreign documentation on British, French, German, and Tsarist Russian conniving at dividing up the world's colonies." The scientists continue, quote, "These pacifist and liberally inclined people believe world government may be a panacea for securing stable peace. Supporters of world government are widely using allegedly radical phrases to the effect that state sovereignty in the atom age has allegedly become a survival of old times, and that this, as Belgian delegate Spaak said at the General Assembly of the United Nations, is an old, outmoded idea, and even reactionary idea. It is difficult to imagine statements which could be further from the truth. Drawing on Russian history, they outlined exactly how international capital enslaved their nation. The Russian people were effectively enslaved like so many in Africa, South America, and the Middle East today, a hub for cheap wages and natural resources extorted at gunpoint by the imperialist capitalists. It's of my opinion that had the Russians not had their October Revolution in 1917, they would be somewhere along the lines of Brazil today, a completely irrelevant country, favelas and, shanty shacks with people living in unclean water, that kind of thing. Quote, "We know this perfectly from experience of our country's past, which is not so long ago. Under Tsarism, foreign capitalists greedily flocked to Russia with its reactionary regime, which was subservient to capital, with its low wages and tremendous natural resources. French, English, Belgian and German firms plunderingly made themselves at home in our country, receiving tremendous profits which were unthinkable in their own countries. They chained Tsarist Russia to the capitalist West with chains of enslaving loans. Money received from foreign banks to the Tsarist government suppressed the revolutionary movement in the country, handicapped the development of Russian science and culture. The Great October Socialist Revolution smashed the chains of economic and political dependence of our country on world capitalist monopolies. The Soviet government for the first time made our country a truly free and independent state, advanced with a tempo unprecedented in the history of humanity. The development of our socialist economy, technique, science and culture and made our country a reliable bulwark of peace and security of the people." Unquote. It should be noted that for international capital to regain control of the Soviet Union and our people and drive them back into poverty and enslavement to Western banks, that the entire West invaded the Soviet Union in 1918 after they had their revolution. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the West came to subjugate the Russian peoples. In the interwar period, Germany was rebuilt with credit and loans from J.P. Morgan and Bank of England as a tip of the spear against the Soviet Union. The Hitlerites, for example, were brought to power by an orchestrated banking crash from American and English banks, trying to expand their influence in Central Europe. After the crash, the Anglo banks refused to give credit to the German government, instead allowing it to crash. Only when the Hitlerites came to power did they then extend credit to German banks. And then even during World War II, Germany was still paying back loans to England and America, even as they were at war with them. The capitalist imperialists tried to plunder the Soviet Union a second time, using the fascist states they had built up in the 1930s. Quote, "Our people defended the independence and civil war battle against a block of imperialist states, and in great battles of the patriotic war against the German fascist invaders. And now the advocates of world superstate invite us to surrender this independence voluntarily in the name of a certain world government, which with a high-sounding trademark conceals world dominations of capitalist monopolies. Are not these proposals ridiculous? They are absurd not only to the Soviet Union. After the Second World War, a number of countries broke away from the capitalist system of oppression and enslavement. Peoples of these countries are strengthening economic and political independence and are not permitting foreign interference in their internal life. Furthermore, the rapid growth of the national liberation movement in colonies and dependent countries awakened the national self-conscience of hundreds of millions of people who do not want to live in the old way like slaves. Monopolies of imperialistic powers which lost some juicy objectives of exploitation are running the risk of losing others and trying through every means to liquidate state sovereignty of people who liberated themselves from domination. Sovereignty which stands in their way, and to prevent the true liberation of colonies. For this purpose, imperialists are using all sorts of methods of military, political, economic, and ideological control. Capitalists despise national sovereignty because it doesn't allow for capital penetration of new markets. However, cosmopolitanism appeals to the intellectuals and intelligentsia of society because it fulfills a performative, lofty ideal to these for their narrow-minded nationalism. Similar to how a rich man may enter a church and exclaim sorrowfully, "Oh me, I am nothing, I am not worthy." But if a poor beggar were to enter the same church and declare, "I am a poor man, I am nothing," the rich man would respond, "Who is this guy to claim he is nothing?" Back to the article. Quote, "In carrying out this social order, the ideologists of imperialism are trying to discredit the very idea of national sovereignty. In doing so, they often advance pompous plans of world state, which would allegedly do away with imperialism, wars, enmity between nations, realization of all human laws, etc. Those usurping aspirations for imperialist forces, which aspire to world domination, appear under a guise of allegedly progressive ideas, which attract certain circles of the intelligentsia in capitalist countries, scientists, writers, and others." I mean, since this was written, a whole professional managerial class has arisen in capitalist societies, and these people, they're the fount of liberalism that, and postmodern filth that comes out into our society. The Soviet scientists reflected on how elections under such a system would be a complete farce. Popular votes in various countries would amount to appointment by colonial administrators. In his open letter, Einstein advances a new version of limitation of state sovereignty. He proposes to reorganize the General Assembly of the United Nations, turning it into a continuously working world parliament, possessing greater authority than the Security Council. Let us try to imagine elections to such a world parliament. At present, the greater part of the human race still lives in colonial or dependent countries where the governors, troops, and financial industrial monopolies of a few imperialistic powers are bosses. Popular vote in such countries would amount to appointment of delegates by colonial administrators or by military authorities. Without looking far, for an example, is enough to recall the comedy of referendum in Greece carried out by its monarchist fascist rulers under the protection of the bayonets of English troops. The scientists then point out how farcical bourgeois democracy is. That is, states ruled by parliamentary electoralism, where capitalists control the media, information flows by big tech, they control communication in form of the post office, and now even the internet. So all these social media campaigns that are artificially created, they're all done by capitalists pouring money in for propaganda purposes. Quote, "In countries of bourgeois democracy, dominating capital through thousands of tricks, barriers, and traps limits universal suffrage and makes freedom an illusion. Does not Einstein know that in the latest elections to the United States, Congress only 39% of the voters participated? That millions of Negroes in southern states are actually deprived of election rights or are not forced, not infrequently, under threat of lynching, to vote for their worst enemies like the late Negro Beta, reactionary of the worst type, Senator Bilbo. Special taxes, examinations, and other tricks are being used to prevent from voting millions of immigrants, workers looking for jobs, and the poorest farmers. We are not even speaking of mass buying of votes and the role of reactionary press, which in the hands of millionaires who own the newspapers is a powerful weapon for influencing the masses." It should be noted at this point that the League of Nations and then the United Nations were not impartial political structures built from inter-country cooperation, but were created by the giant robber barons of the 19th century, like the Rockefellers. a point the Soviet scientists make. Quote, although all this shows what popular election to the World Parliament would look like under existing conditions of the capitalist world, its composition would not be any better than the present composition of the General Assembly. It would be a crooked mirror of the true mind of the masses of the people, of their aspirations and hopes for stable peace. The vast majority of nations are in an independent position regarding the United States, and are forced to adapt their foreign policy to the demands of Washington. Thus, for instance, a number of countries in Latin America with monoculture agriculture are in a state of servile dependence on American monopolies, which are fixing prices for their produce. No wonder that under the pressure of the American delegation in the General Assembly, there is created a great mechanical majority which votes on orders from their real bosses. In a number of cases, American diplomacy, for understandable reasons, prefers to put through certain measures, not on behalf of the State Department, but under the flag of the United Nations. This, for instance, was the case in the notorious Balkan Commission and the Commission for Supervision of Elections in Korea. After World War II, the United States carved up Korea in 1945 under the flag of the UN and declared a US military dictatorship. In the south, they would invade the north of Korea in 1950 under the United Nations flag because the United Nations was a puppet of the United States. Collier's magazine would also draw up a fantasy of nuclear bombing the Soviet Union in 1952. A thing I've talked about in a previous video clip. Watch it here.
I'll quickly flick to Collier's Weekly. So this was October 1951 this was written, and it's a big article, about 100 pages in the magazine. It's titled The Preview of the War We Do Not Want. Now in this, they have a United Nations military occupation of Russia. And this is written a year after the Korean War, which was a United Nations war to divide up Korea and have the United Nations occupy it. So as you can see the UN flags there on over Moscow, and in the top right you can see Russia's defeat and occupation, 1952, 1960. So the article's written from a kind of a future perspective of when they've conquered Russia or conquered the Soviet Union, and they've raised the UN flag over Moscow. Now, let me just get to it. Now, if you go to the article, you see that, and I'll read the caption for you there. It says, the bomb strikes Moscow in retaliation for heavy attacks on UN cities. Seconds later, Kremlin, within enclosure in foreground, was swept into oblivion. Red Square surrounding Avenue was heaped with rubble. St. Basil's Church, bulbous towers at right, was gone. Now, what you're seeing there is a nuclear inferno of Moscow City. This was their plan to basically impose their will on the Soviet Union. This would basically be staved off by their failure during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. They were unable to occupy Korea, and that war basically goes on till today.
The Yugoslav wars by NATO in the 1990s were done under the responsibility to protect, which says that national sovereignty is superseded under conditions of extreme human rights abuses. This is why the United States constantly builds up its enemies into literally Hitler, so they can justify overriding their sovereignty and destroying those nations. Quote, Einstein's project would actually lead to the same results, and thus not only would not help securing stable peace and international collaboration, but would serve only as a cover for a drive against peoples who have created a system which does not permit foreign capital to draw its usual profits. This is the road to unlimited expansion of American imperialism, and this is the way to disarm ideologically peoples who are defending their independence, unquote. Now, at this time, US imperialism was quite open about its plans for world domination and world government. American and European capitalists would eventually form the Club of Rome, who planned on dividing up the world into 10 kingdoms, essentially dividing the world into economic regions. Plans have been afoot to do this for decades with regional blocs like the European Union and North American Union. The European Union itself was a CIA creation. The Soviet scientists stated plainly that if the United Nations remained a weapon of US imperialism, there would be no other choice but to blow up the organization. Quote, if one does not succeed in turning the United Nations completely into a weapon and the State Department of the United States into cover for imperialistic plans and schemes, it is necessary to blow up this organization from inside and create in its place a new international organization without the participation of the Soviet Union and countries of new democracy. The road which Einstein urges delegations of states, members of the UN, to enter does not lead toward a strengthening of international security, but into a blind alley of new international complications. Such a road is only profitable for those circles of monopolistic capital to which those complications offer a promise of new war orders and new profits." Unquote. So who really advances world government in which humanity is reduced to a new type of technocratic serfdom? The communists who unreservedly respect the right to self-determination, i.e. to break free from relations with other nations if they see fit, and the full flowering of nations and development of their culture. Here's a quote from Stalin on that. Quote, "Right of self-determination means that only the nation itself has a right to determine its destiny, that no one has a right forcibly to interfere in the life of the nation, to destroy its schools and other institutions, to violate its habits and customs, to repress its language, or curtail its rights." And that's from Stalin, Marxism and the National Question. Or capitalists who see opportunities for new markets and an unlimited supply of wage slaves, willing to undercut native workers, and nationalism itself a threat to their cosmopolitanism rule, where they've turned the entire world's cities of factory lines of Starbucks, McDonald's, and frankly, degenerate culture. National Question and Marxism. Right, it's important to take a second to dive into some Marxism here to understand what is meant by nations. A nation is not a state. Belgium, Switzerland, and Canada are all states, but not nations. Similarly, the British state includes part of Ireland, which is the Irish nation. So we shouldn't have a state that includes part of another people's, another nation. These states have been artificially created for political reasons. In Stalin's famous Marxism National Question, he tackles the question of what makes a nation in the context of burgeoning Zionism that was beginning to declare that the Jewish people were a nation, not a peoples. After an exhaustive investigation, Stalin concludes, quote, "A nation is a historically constituted stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture." Unquote. Without the common language, how would they even communicate with each other? Without a common territory, how can they develop together? Without an economic life, how can they labour beside each other? And without the first three, how can they develop a common culture? The communist position toward the nation is the same as the communist position to the state. We communists are not for the state. The state has not always existed. It arose in a period of class struggle in slave societies when a state became a necessity to stop what would be continual warfare between classes. So arose an administrative state with a judiciary and an armed body of men to protect private property. Though we are not formally for the state, we recognise that as long as the state exists, they can only be wielded as weapons at other classes. They can be wielded by a tiny minority, like a decadent capitalist class in an open conspiracy against the working class, scheming how to reduce their numbers, pushing degenerate culture, opening the borders to subdue wages, and reduce their bargaining power with the capitalist class, and send them to fight and die in wars for giant monopolies like BlackRock and Wall Street and the City of London, as many mercenaries have died all over the Middle East and Ukraine in recent decades. Or the state can be wielded by the working class, the vast majority in society, against a tiny and dying capitalist class. Under these conditions of class warfare, the state should be strengthened and will eventually die away. Stalin explains how this is similar for nations. The national cultures should be allowed to flower entirely under socialism in a dialectic that would allow them to develop and unfold into completeness. Only having reached that point would the nation wither away and develop in the direction of building a worldwide common culture and language. And this is a quote from Stalin. Point of fact, the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat and of the building of socialism in the USSR is a period of the flowering of national cultures that are socialist in content and national in form. For under the Soviet system, the nations themselves are not the ordinary modern nations, but socialist nations, just as in content, their national cultures are not the ordinary bourgeois cultures, but socialist cultures. They apparently fail to understand that national cultures are bound to develop with new strength with the introduction and firm establishment of compulsory universal elementary education in their native languages. They fail to understand that if only the national cultures are developed, will it be possible really to draw the backward nationalities into the work of socialist construction. They fail to understand that this is just the basis of the Leninist policy of helping and promoting the development of the national cultures of the peoples of the USSR. It may seem strange that we who stand for the future merging of national cultures into one common, both in form and content, culture, with one common language, should at the same time stand for the flowering of national cultures at the present moment, in the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat. There is nothing strange about it. The national cultures must be allowed to develop and unfold, to reveal all their potentialities in order to create the conditions for merging them into one common culture. with one common language in the period of the victory of socialism all over the world. The flowering of cultures that are national in form and socialist in content under the dictatorship of the proletariat in one country for the purpose of merging them into one common socialist, both in form and content, culture, with one common language when the proletariat is victorious all over the world and when socialism becomes a way of life. It is just this that constitutes the dialectics of the Leninist presentation of the question of national culture. It may be said that such a presentation of the question is contradictory, but is there not the same contradictoriness in our presentation of the question of the state? We stand for the withering away of the state, at the same time we stand for the strengthening of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the mightiest and strongest state power that has ever existed. The highest development of state power with the object of preparing the conditions for the withering away of state power. Such is the Marxist formula. Is this contradictory? Yes, it is contradictory. But this contradiction is bound up with life and it fully reflects Marx's dialectics. That's from Stalin's concerning deviations in the national question. But by the end of World War II, Stalin warned that the capitalists of the West had undergone a fundamental change. They had abandoned their nation because capital chases all over the world. They had become fundamentally cosmopolitan in world outlook, and now they sold their nation, their people, for dollars. He says it here, quote, "Earlier, the bourgeoisie as the heads of the nation were for the rights and independence of nations and put that above all. Now there is no trace left of this national principle. Now the bourgeoisie sell the rights and independence of their nation for dollars. The banner of national independence and national sovereignty has been thrown overboard. Without doubt, you representatives of the communist and democratic parties must raise this banner and carry it forward if you want to be patriots of your own countries, if you want to be the leading powers of the nations. There is nobody else to raise it." Stormy applause. As from Stalin's speech at the 19th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Now, a nation is subject to history and has a beginning and end. Over the communist position, there have been wanton liquidation of the nation for rootless cosmopolitanism. By this point in the article, though, we can easily see how the capitalists want to reduce humanity to rootless victims of capital, blown hither and thither by the exigencies of capital. Now, rootless cosmopolitanism. Marxists and Leninists have always opposed cosmopolitanism. It's not hard to understand why. Reading some of these quotes from Marx and Engels could easily apply to the modern day. Just trade Germany and Germans for United States and Americans. These modern day Americans who believe the entire world should be made after their image. Marx held utter contempt for these enlightened bourgeois intellectuals who believed they had risen above their nation and nationality. That the attempt to rise above your own nationality was itself a reflection of inflated and extravagant national pride. Quote, "These pompous and arrogant hucksters of ideas who imagine themselves infinitely exalted above all national prejudices are thus, in practice, far more national than the beer-swilling Philistines who dream of a united Germany. They do not recognize the deeds of other nations as historical. They live in Germany, within Germany, and for Germany. They turn the Rhine Song 25 into a religious hymn and conquer Alsace and Lorraine by robbing French philosophy instead of the French state, by Germanizing French ideas instead of French provinces. Herr Venede is a cosmopolitan compared with the saints Bruno and Max, who in the universal dominance of theory proclaim the universal dominance of Germany." That's pretty much similar to how the Americans act today. They act like they are a universal country, which is the rest of the world is just waiting to catch up to be American. And another quote from him. "In this essay, we have yet further evidence of the narrowly national outlook which underlies the alleged universalism and cosmopolitanism of the Germans. With infinite self-confidence, the Germans confront the other peoples with this airy realm of dreams, the realm of the essence of man, claiming it is the consummation and goal of all world history in every sphere. They regard their dreamy fantasies as a final verdict on the actions of other nations. And because everywhere their lot is merely to look on and be left high and dry, they believe themselves called upon to sit in judgment on the whole world while history attains its ultimate purpose in Germany. We've already observed several times that the complement of this inflated and extravagant national pride is practical activity of the pettiest kind, worthy of shopkeepers and artisans. Narrow national mindedness is everywhere repellent. In Germany, it is positively odious, since together with the illusion that the Germans are superior to nationality and to all real interests, it is held in the face of those nations which openly confess their national limitations and their dependence upon real interests." And that's from Marx Collected Works, Volume 5. So Marx outright rejected some version of Trotskyism where a revolution will happen simultaneously in many countries in the Communist Manifesto, stating, Since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise itself to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation, it is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. Lenin restated this plainly, despite however much Trotskyite howling exists. Quote, uneven economic and political development is an absolute law of capitalism. Hence the victory of socialism is possible first in several or even in one capitalist country alone. After expropriating the capitalists and organising their own socialist production, the victorious proletariat of the country will arise against the rest of the world. The capitalist world, attracting to its cause the oppressed classes of other countries, stirring uprisings in those countries against the capitalists, and in case of need, using even armed force against the exploiting classes and their states. That's Lenin on the slogan for the United States of Europe. But in 1949, Chernov, one of the communist leaders in the Central Committee for the Soviet Union, would write a retort to the capitalist countries expressing rootless cosmopolitanism as their new ideology. Discussing the rootless cosmopolitans in Soviet society in literature and art, Chernov reaffirms that rootless cosmopolitanism is the ideology of the imperialist capitalists. An anti-patriotic group of rootless cosmopolitans in theatre criticism aspire to spread national nihilism, alien to Marxism, Leninism, and deeply inimical to the Soviet people. National nihilism is a manifestation of the anti-patriotic ideology of bourgeois cosmopolitanism, disrespect for the national pride and the national dignity of peoples. Comrade Stalin said national nihilism only injures the cause of socialism, acting as a tool for bourgeois nationalists. Comrade Stalin strongly spoke out against those who suggested that the struggle with nationalism must at the same time throw away everything that is national. National nihilism in our conditions is a form of struggle chosen by rootless cosmopolitans against Soviet patriotism, against Soviet culture, national informed socialist in content. It is a display of their cringing before bourgeois culture. In this way, national nihilism with its attitude towards the great Russian people and the other peoples of our nation time and again was linked in the minds of rootless cosmopolitans with bourgeois nationalism, which today is inseparably tied with cosmopolitan ideology of the imperialist bourgeoisie. That's from F. Chernov's Bourgeois Cosmopolitanism and its reactionary role. He followed this up with the most poisonous ideological weapon of the hostile capitalist encirclement is bourgeois cosmopolitanism, consisting in part of cringing before foreign things and civility before bourgeois culture. Rootless cosmopolitanism produces special dangers because cosmopolitanism is the ideological banner of militant international reaction, the ideal weapon in its hands for the struggle against socialism and democracy. Therefore, the struggle with the ideology of cosmopolitanism is total and definitive unmasking, and overcoming acquires in the present time particular acuity and urgency. Unquote. If we consider how American cosmopolitan culture has been exported as a weapon, particularly with its poisonous brand of identity politics, or its paedophile apologist factory called Hollywood that exports ever more degenerate films and culture, to be consumed by the world's people to fog their minds and keep them entertained to death. Chernov located the ideology of cosmopolitanism arising from production of bourgeois society. The ideology of cosmopolitanism arises from the same manner of production of bourgeois society. Cosmopolitanism is the negation of patriotism, its opposite. It advocates absolute apathy towards the fate of the motherland. Cosmopolitanism denies the existence of any moral or civil obligations of people to their nation and motherland. The bourgeoisie preaches the principle that money does not have a homeland, and that wherever one can make money, wherever one may have a profitable business, there is his homeland. Here is the villainy the bourgeois cosmopolitanism is called on to conceal, to disguise, to ennoble the anti-patriotic ideology of the rootless bourgeois businessman, the huckster and travelling salesman. Harmful cosmopolitan ideology serves to the bourgeoisie and its agents as a very convenient ideological tool for excusing and covering up all kinds of anti-patriotic actions, national treason and political double-dealing. Marx showed that bourgeois patriotism degenerated into a complete sham after its financial, commercial and industrial activity acquired a cosmopolitan character. Club of Rome divides the world into 10 kingdoms. It's important to look at the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome is one of the most important imperialist institutions on earth, alongside the Bilderberg Group, World Economic Forum, Davos and Trilateral Commission. All institutions created for the smooth running of capitalism worldwide. In the 1960s, the Club of Rome divided the world into 10 kingdoms. In reality, economic zones. Interestingly, some on the right, like Alex Jones, who created an entire documentary titled Endgame, documenting how they were going to dissolve the United States into a North American Union, have recently come out cheering for the United States absorbing Canada and Greenland, which accurately matches the map of the 10 kingdoms. The Trilateral Commission, whose members have included the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein and Keir Starmer, wrote a document in the 1970s titled The Crisis of Democracy. Now, this document basically lamented the fact that people had some limited form of democratic rule in their countries, and for the smooth running of capitalism, they needed to find a new way to govern these countries. Georges Cogneau, a member of the Central Committee of the French Communist Party, who had played a particularly heroic role in defeating the Hitlerite collaborators under the Vichy government, noted a similar pattern in an article titled Cosmopolitanism, Weapon of Predatory US Imperialism. In its struggle for world domination, predatory US imperialism makes wide use of the ideology of the bourgeois cosmopolitanism as a weapon to enslave the peoples who are defending their national independence and sovereignty on the way to world domination. US imperialism counters the persistent and ever-growing resistance of all who treasure national independence and freedom of their homeland. The ideology of cosmopolitanism declares the conception of national sovereignty to be obsolete, preaches complete indifference to the fate of one's own homeland, national nihilism, and declares the very concept of nation and state to be a fiction. Cosmopolitanism denies the patriotism of the masses of the people, patriotism which is a bar to the realization of the predatory plans of the imperialists. It plays into the hands of anti-popular, anti-patriotic forces of the bourgeoisie which demand capitulation before US imperialism. The patriotism of the bourgeoisie, said Marx, has degenerated into sheer hypocrisy since its financial trade and industrial activities have acquired a cosmopolitan character. What's more, cosmopolitanism was a weapon in every single cultural and scientific sphere, producing bourgeois pseudoscience, corrupting art and morals of the working people. The pseudoscience of Mendelianism is a fascinating one, given the complete bankruptcy of that theory and recent discoveries that have vindicated Lysenko in the renamed epigenetics. It is common knowledge that US competition is strangling the British and ousting French cinema production. One British member of Parliament was right in speaking about a veritable Niagara of vulgarity, false sentimentalism, cynicism, and pornography which distracts the attention of readers in martialized countries from the real America, with its poverty, millions of unemployed, cultural backwardness, racial discrimination, and its struggle against progressive science. The dissemination of pseudoscientific Mendelian and Morgan theories in biology, the idealistic and metaphysical conceptions in physics, psychology, and teaching, and in general the propaganda of objectivism in science, formalism and abstraction in art, the spreading of idealistic, decadent theory that literature and art must be divided from the people and from reality.
All this goes hand in hand with the intensification of brutal police repressions against honest and patriotic-minded cultural workers, with the systematic deterioration of their living standards and invariable reductions in budget allocations for cultural needs. All this is done on the US model and on its insistence. All this is tainted with cosmopolitanism. The real content of cosmopolitanism in the realm of culture is reaction and decadence of a neo-fascist character. It is the penetration into other countries of the well-known barbaric culture which characterizes imperialist America. As with the struggle for peace, for independence, and against the colonizing policy, the struggle for culture demands that cosmopolitan tendencies to be resolutely repulsed. In all capitalist countries, the right socialists, the Blums, Guy Malays, Bevins, Spacks, Renners, Schumachers, and Surrogates are the main advocates of cosmopolitanism, inveterate enemies of national sovereignty, which is regarded by them as an obsolete prejudice. They preach world government under the aegis of the US British imperialists. The acceptance of the notorious American way of life, which is praised by them, would in practice mean the turning of peoples not only into drought animals, but also into cannon fodder for the Wall Street capitalists. Mendel's bourgeois pseudoscience produced an entire epoch in which man could be divided into superior and lesser. The pseudoscientists began to start measuring skulls, and before long enough were exterminating their own people under the Action T4 program. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, we lost a truly independent sovereign nation that was able to produce working class science, not the filth produced out of the Rockefeller Foundation captured universities to benefit the bourgeoisie. Quote, "The long-suppressed logic of Johansen that has stalked the gene god for decades has come home to roost. Scientists now understand that the information in the DNA code can only serve as a template for a protein. It cannot possibly serve as an instructions for the more complex task of putting the proteins together into a fully functioning being, no more than the characters on a typewriter can produce a story." In a paper in Physics of Life Reviews in 2013,
James Shapiro describes how cells and organisms are capable of natural genetic engineering. That is, they frequently alter their own DNA sequences, rewriting their own genomes throughout life. The startling implication is that the gene, as popularly conceived, a blueprint on a strand of DNA determining development and its variations, does not really exist. And that's from Ken Richardson. It's the end of the gene as we know it, Jan 2019. But Lysenko had rubbished this trash decades and decades ago. Since August Weismann incorrectly declared that the germline could not be interfered with and Mendel's pea-breeding pseudoscience, we have been gifted an array of bourgeois pseudosciences. From biology to virology to transgenderism and the complete corruption in climate science, to statistical computer modelling done by the cosmopolitan imperialists, the Club of Rome, and their filth in their limits to growth. The computer modelling done by such frauds as Neil Ferguson, the Centre for Disease Control, and Anthony Fauci, and the World Health Organization that locked the entire world in their homes and then fed the entire world unsafe medical prescriptions. The promotion of cosmopolitan ideology is a predatory weapon of US imperialism produced by capitalist society. We continue to pay a very high price for not having destroyed capitalist imperialism. From our way of life, which is increasingly destroyed by parasitic companies that produce nothing but financialize everything. Our culture fed a steady diet of pornography and people being murdered on screen compared to the beautiful art and literature produced under socialist societies, to art that is intended to destroy the human spirit. To the pseudoscience that says there are too many people as eugenics programs come back in the West, particularly under Canada and now in Britain with the Right to Die and Kim Leadbeater and a horrible campaign. As if Marx and the passage of time had not debunked this reactionary filth 150 years ago. To that we say there are too many capitalists and there will never be enough workers. Our class has a great future. Each young worker will add something precious to our future society. The ideology of globe-trotting cosmopolitanism needs defeating first, however. Thank you for tuning in. Richie Brown signing off.